I'm Mike Sheridan, and this is The Delve. Hey, you're very welcome along to another episode of The Delve with me, Mike Sheridan, brought to you by our friends at Spotlight Oral Care. Use the code DELVE25 for 25% off everything at checkout. So my guest today is Meghan Daum. We spoke to Meghan way back at the start of lockdown. I had just finished reading her book, The Problem with Everything, and really loved it. It's such an easy read. I flew through it. And it's kind of, I suppose, ostensibly at least based around the culture wars or the lack of nuance, two elements of the culture wars. Especially, I think at the moment, it's quite prevalent. If you peek into social media at any point, something along those lines seems to be going on. Meghan has written for some of the biggest and best publications in the world. She wrote for the LA Times for a long time. She's written for the New York Times, the New Yorker. And she also has a new podcast called The Unspeakable. And the first episode should be out now. So please do enjoy this conversation with Meghan Daum.
How are you?
I'm good. Are you in New York, or did you head outside the city? Are you still outside?
No, I escaped. I did the shameful thing, and I went to the countryside. And then I made the mistake of writing about it. So I was dragged on Twitter all last week, mercilessly.
I was going to say, because I responded to your tweet about that article. I really liked the article. And a couple of days ago, I started getting weird emojis and like of babies and poo and stuff like that.
Oh, you started getting?
Because I had responded. I was like, where has this come from? So what happened here? And this is like a prime example of kind of online outrage.
Well, it was interesting because I realized what the mistake I made. I was trying to be vague about my whereabouts. And so I just said Appalachia, which is a huge area, sort of the southeastern toward the Midwest part of the US. It encompasses like 5 or 6 states. And I'm in Virginia. I'm in southwestern Virginia. But I didn't want to say that. So I just said Appalachia. And the thing is, Appalachia, there's a lot of baggage around that in the US. It's associated with like extreme rural poverty and a lot of opioid crisis. And so I just didn't think about it. So a lot of people, there's a sort of social justice wing of Appalachians, and they, assume anybody from the outside who even says the word is punching down, as if you're talking about, as if you're making fun of them, which I wasn't at all. And so I just sort of hit a tripwire with that group, and it just completely ignited.
How do you deal with that now? Has it changed how you kind of deal with blowback? As I know you mentioned in the book.
Yeah, I really try to take the high road. I don't get in Twitter fights. I would probably have more followers if I did. And I, in this case, I just sort of, I ignored it for a long time, and then they started getting really upset, like I was a virus spreader. Then people started behaving as if they were genuinely concerned that I was spreading the plague down here and that their safety was threatened, that I was a literal murderer, literal. And so then I said, well, okay, like, I'll clear up a few things. And I explained I had quarantined on both sides, et cetera, et cetera. But that just, anytime you validate them with a reaction, it just makes it worse. So yeah. I still think ignoring it is 9 times out of 10 the best way to handle it.
Meghan, I love the book.
Thank you.
The book's called The Problem with Everything. I asked my girlfriend to download it just so I could have somebody to talk about it with. The Problem with Everything wasn't the initial title for it. You had a different title for it, and you kind of go into that in the book as well.
Yeah. So, well, initially it started off as a book about feminism. So I started thinking about all of this stuff probably in late 2014, early 2015. I started to notice that a lot of the conversation around women's issues was rooted in this premise that women were like some sort of monolithic oppressed group. Like suddenly there was this idea that anything you said as a woman was by default a political statement. that, you know, any given man had more power than any given woman. And it really flew in the face of all the assumptions I had growing up as a girl in the 70s and the 80s. And I always considered myself a feminist and still do. But I noticed that a lot of the online discourse was really reductive and you know, completely lacking in nuance and critical thinking. And there was this whole idea of the badass, right? So, you know, you saw that online a lot, and on you know, Tumblr blogs and on social media. Like, you know, there was this sort of notion that, you know, just being a woman in the world was so difficult, that getting out of bed every morning and going to work and, you know, facing down the patriarchy at every turn, you know, simply by showing up to your job and paying your rent on time made you a badass. And I thought it was so silly and also like insulting to women. Like, you know, we're so infantilized that somehow, you know, the littlest bit of effort is considered heroic. So yes, to answer your question, initially the book was going to be called "You Are Not a Badass," and then it was going to be maybe like, "Well, you're probably not a badass. There are some badasses in the world." But by then, Trump was elected. You know, I started that version of the book assuming that Hillary Clinton would be elected president. That didn't happen. I was as shocked as anyone. And so I had to sort of reframe the book. But at the same time, the conversation around all these issues really mushroomed well beyond feminism, and the social justice conversation was everywhere. And so, you know, there was just all of this sort of, you know, competing marginalized groups and shaming, and it really took on a life of its own. So the book became much broader than just a discussion of feminism. And so it was about sort of the wokeness industrial complex in general.
And you were actually around the same time, you were going to a college campus to do a semester of teaching. So you had this kind of first-hand insight into that generation of people or kids or whatever, young adults, whatever you want to call them, and how they're reacting to stuff in real time. And you kind of said, like, look, both extremes are wrong. You know, they're not the like super social justice warriors that you think they are, but you know, they're not. You know, there's a middle ground. Basically, you kind of that's the nuance in it.
Yeah, you know, it was a really strange time to be on a college campus. It was strange for the students. It was strange for me as a teacher. So I went out to do a visiting professorship at the University of Iowa, and that's a state in the Midwest, generally a very Republican state, very conservative. The college town where the university is more liberal. So, you know, there's a strange dynamic when you get into liberal enclaves in otherwise very conservative areas. The people in those enclaves tend to be, you know, want to let you know how liberal they are all the time. There's an overcompensation that goes on. So, you know, you had that dynamic in the town itself. But I was teaching these students, and they were adults. They were graduate students. So these were people in their 20s, sometimes their late 20s. And I was teaching a cultural criticism class, among other things. And I found that I couldn't even get through the material. I was trying to teach them just some of my favorite works of nonfiction and cultural criticism, stuff that have been really important for me as a young writer, and even more recently, and you know, pieces that entertained a level of moral complexity and where the author was sort of, you know, testing his or her own assumptions and you know, being self-scrutinizing. And I found that I couldn't get through the material a lot of the time because the students would stop and say, whoa, I can't read about this. I can't read this author sort of, you know, trying to sort through her experience of sexual assault and wondering, you know, if she was complicit in some ways, or wondering about the various layers of this, because it's internalized misogyny, and I'm not even going to read any further. And it was really striking that it wasn't just that they were, that they found it distasteful, they found it frightening. They didn't even want to be confronted with a point of view that would throw them off course and make them wrestle with their own assumptions. And it was just like, well, that's the whole point of being a student, if not a thinking person in the world.
Is an element of that, you think, is the tribalism and just wanting to fit in?
Yeah, there's a lot of that. You know, I ultimately, you know, so the book, first it was going to be called You Are Not a Badass. Then it was going to be called Woke Me When It's Over. I still sort of wish that had been the title. And ultimately became The Problem with Everything. And, you know, obviously that's talking about, you know, how we label so many things problematic now. But ultimately, for me, the problem with everything is just a sort of ambient loneliness, and the way people are so disconnected and so sort of alone with their thoughts that they have to sort of congeal into these online tribes. And so they end up, I think, you know, I see a lot of people attaching themselves to ideas that they don't necessarily hold.
Well, I have this theory here, because Ireland's kind of not a few years behind, but America, that old cliche that America sneezes and the rest of the world gets a cold. And that's
a dangerous analogy.
It is a very dangerous analogy right now, actually. God, yeah. We're taping this at the end of April.
The whole world coughs together now, I guess.
So I've been an editor here. I've edited a couple of the bigger publications here. So, and kind of more specifically in the early, like 2012, 2013, from then on inwards. So I know, like around then, at least in Ireland, it was all clickbait. So this is, you need to get as many eyeballs as you can on the content that you're going to read. And it's obviously variations of whether they're BuzzFeed, quizzes or something like that. Or you won't believe what, and then it's aggregation sites basically. And I've been as guilty as anybody at refining those. But you talk about the media a little bit in the book too. But I have this theory that it's almost like the evolution of clickbait has become hot takes. So there's these zeitgeisty, dip your toe in the water, see what Twitter's saying, and then just kind of write accordingly, and that's the new clickbait.
Yeah, one of the things that's really frustrating for me as a journalist, as an essayist, is, it used to be that having an original idea, having an idea that was provocative, yet also thought through, not gratuitously provocative, but a little risky, taking intellectual risks, that was what you were supposed to do. You were supposed to go against the grain. Early in my career, I started publishing things in the, early to mid 1990s when I was in my 20s. And I would write controversial essays, and, I would try to think them through. And I had the benefit of editors, and we did rewrites, and we had fact checkers, and, there was a very involved process to publishing. I'm sure you remember this distant past. And, a piece would come out, and maybe it would get some angry letters to the editor, and I would see them maybe 6 weeks later. A few of them were published. But in the meantime, I would be on to the next assignment. If I made people angry, or if I, forced them to think about things they didn't want to think about, that was the job. I mean, I always saw my role as an essayist, as sort of looking at the world, looking at where the hypocrisies are, looking at the places where people are maybe thinking and feeling one thing, but saying something else, where the conventional wisdom is really at odds with the truth or people's honest intellectual experiences. So I wanted to always examine those things. And that's really what excites me as a writer. And for a long time in my career, I was rewarded for that I would get more assignments, and in like places like the New Yorker and the New York Times, like, the elite media, the mainstream elite media. And I noticed what's happened in the last 5 to 10 years is that you get rewarded if you say the obvious thing. You get rewarded if you play to your audience, if you get a lot of, positive feedback on social media, and, really challenging assumptions is like the thing you're not supposed to do. And I just, that blows my mind, quite honestly. I don't see any sort of upside in that. So that's something that I talk to students about all the time. And it's really hard for them, because how do you even get started in this climate as a public thinker and writer? I don't know.
Hey guys, sorry to interrupt the show. I just wanted to briefly tell you about our sponsor for this season of The Delve, Spotlight Oral Care, which is an Irish company founded by 2 Irish dentists. They're a sustainable company, they're an ethical company. So long story short about me and my teeth, I had my teeth straightened a couple of years ago. It made me hyper aware of oral care in general. Spotlight Oral Care really recognise that and do products specific for people. So I've been using their men's teeth whitening strips for a couple of weeks now. I've found them fantastic. I've also been using, which is the crown and the jewel for me, the Sonic toothbrush, which is just a phenomenal product. It's got 3 different settings. It's got a 2-minute timer, so you're cleaning your teeth for 2 minutes. I'm using their sensitive toothpaste, and you're cleaning your teeth for 2 minutes, and it just switches off. You're like, okay, I've brushed my teeth for the sufficient amount of time. They've also given us a discount code of Delve25. So if you use the code Delve25, you'll get 25% off any Spotlight oral care products on their site. Back to the show. It's funny because if anybody's going to call somebody out on Twitter for something, I suppose relatively inane, should be forced to share their WhatsApp group messages. So WhatsApp groups here are huge, memes, and most of them are like super offensive and stuff. At least some of my crazy friends, some of the stuff that they send me, so it's almost, it really is an hypocrisy, because it's one thing is almost public and one thing is very much private, but you would never share, those private elements.
It's funny. I don't use WhatsApp. I'm such a late adopter. Like I'm really, I recoil at even emojis and I hate GIFs more than anything. GIFs,
you should just see me trying to set all this up a few minutes ago, running around. Like,
yeah.
These are people for this.
Showing my age, but yeah, I know. I keep thinking that we'll move past this moment. I mean, one of the things that happened when Trump came along, and this is obviously happening globally, this sort of extreme populism, it really gave the left an excuse to not engage in critical thinking. I mean, I talk about this a lot in the book. Like, this was already happening in the left, and I want to be really clear that this kind of fetishization of victimization, if you will, was happening well before Trump. And I think Trump was a symptom of this and an outgrowth of it. But anyway, this was sort of already all in play. And then Trump was elected, and the left was like, oh my gosh, we need all hands on deck. We cannot afford any kind of straying from the narrative. We can't afford any kind of critical thinking or nuance, because if we say something that might be too complicated for everybody to understand, if we give the other side any opportunity to like hijack our ideas and use them for bad, we just can't have that. So therefore, everything is going to be sort of hashtag resistance and pussy hats and believe women and just really, really reductive ways of processing the world. And I think it's been to our huge detriment. And frankly, most people are tired of it. It's the media that keeps going on with it. Your average person on the street can see through this BS, but somehow a lot of blue check people on Twitter are happy to perpetuate it.
Yeah, it's interesting because comedians seem to be the ones to predict that Trump was going to win, and comedians were the ones to predict Trump was going to win because a lot of them are traveling throughout America constantly.
Right.
They're going to those kind of smaller towns and stuff in America. But you said that not that you became unpopular with your friends, but your opinions were kind of weren't, as zeitgeisty as, the things that are talking around the dinner table at dinner parties, whatever it is. So did you find yourself drifting?
Yeah, I mean,
from your core group, or?
I was on the wrong side all of a sudden, which was bizarre because we all used to think this way. Like, we all, I think, had pretty sort of ironic views of the world and of politics, and especially as women. I mean, I talk about this a lot in the book. I grew up and I was born in 1970, so I was a kid in the 70s. I was a teenager in the 80s, and throughout all that time, I never once had a sense of myself as a girl being anything but equal to boys. In fact, the girls were doing better than the boys. Even in the 70s, the girls were doing better in school. The boys were always acting up. By the time I got to college, there were more women enrolled in college than men. We still have more, slightly more women graduating from law school, and I think even medical school than men. Obviously, there are inequalities, but this is a whole other rabbit hole to go down. We don't have to necessarily go down it, but I think that it's biologically determined unfairly, I would say, but I don't think it's a grand conspiracy against women. And I always got the sense that we identified as feminists, but we all pretty much agreed that it was complex and that people were free to make their own choices, that you were accountable for your own choices. And there was a just kind of baseline understanding of, among kind of educated thinking women. And somehow around 2014, it became fashionable to deny all those complexities. You were on the right side of history if suddenly you were seeing patriarchal forces everywhere, if you were seeing male exploitation at the hands of men everywhere. And it felt really disingenuous to me. And I couldn't figure out why women that I had agreed with, for decades, were suddenly seeing it differently. And frankly, I still am not sure why they're seeing it differently. There's a lot of social rewards for going along with that narrative and a lot of social penalties for resisting it. But I still find it curious that, so many people who have so much agency and so many resources are happy to see oppression at every turn.
You talk about that as well, and the analogy you use in the book is about like kind of giving men unnecessary levity. When a guy in his who in his mid-30s or something goes to view an apartment that you and your female roommate are staying in, and he kind of makes a misogynistic comment about you do the cooking, I'll pay for the food. And back then, this was whatever the early 90s, you thought it was funny. You were laughing at the guy.
That was an interesting moment because that happened in probably 1995 or 4 or something like that. So I had this apartment in New York City. We always had 3 roommates at any time. So one person would leave and we would have to interview for a third roommate. And so my roommate and I, 2 women, we were interviewing people, and this guy came in. And he was probably like 10 or 15 years older than we were. And he said something like, hey, I have an idea. If I move in here, how about if I pay for the food and you girls do the cooking? And, my roommate was in film school. I was in graduate school. We never really cooked anything. And we found this hysterically funny. Like we were embarrassed for him. Like we couldn't look at each other because we were burst out laughing. And in retrospect, I think about that moment and I think about how, we were in our early 20s then, it was the early 90s. If that had happened to our mothers 20, 30 years earlier in the 60s, for instance, in the Mad Men era, I think our mothers would have been very offended. Our feminist mothers would have taken that more seriously and in less good humor than we did. And interestingly, 30 years on, today, if something like that happened with young women, I suspect they would immediately run to their computers and go on social media and complain about this guy and, say like, fuck the patriarchy and how this was classic example of toxic masculinity and all this. And they would get a lot of reward for it. So I talk a lot about in the book how like there was, I think as a Gen Xer, we're really in a lot of ways in this sweet spot where we did not grow up assuming that we were oppressed, and yet we also didn't have this kind of onslaught of social media all the time telling us that we should feel oppressed. So I am mindful of the advantages of being a Gen Xer. We certainly had it a lot easier than our mothers. There was real chauvinism and sexism in the workplace. Not that there isn't now, but it was ubiquitous back then. And I think we had it easier than young people today for a lot of reasons. And I can go into some of those theories of mine, but I am mindful of the ways in which things have changed and how my experience, I'm really speaking as a Gen Xer and somebody who had the benefit of being young at a certain time of history,
So final question before I let you go. If Biden wins in November, if Biden wins in November 3rd or November 4th, and he's saying he's going to have, or he's committed to having a female running mate, do you see this change? I know, but do you see this changing? Do you see, the culture wars maybe been scaled back a little bit, for want of a better term of it? Or people calming down, not getting as mad, the tribalism stopping?
Well, what I wish dearly is that Biden had said, I will pick the most qualified candidate as a running mate, and then chosen a woman. To say from the beginning, I'm going to choose a woman, that's immediately putting that woman in a tokenized position. I can't for the life of me see why that is a feminist gesture. To say, I'm going to choose, don't worry, I'm going to check this box. And so, yeah, I'll be happy when he has a running mate. Frankly, I might be a little surprised if Joe Biden actually is the nominee. I think
people saying that, yeah.
Many things could happen along the way. And I'm frankly worried about his ability to beat Trump. But yeah, that sort of, frankly, virtue signaling and pandering to what he perceives as a progressive base that he needs to attract, that was a Twitter move for him to say that he's pandering to people on Twitter, which frankly are a tiny fraction of voters and pretty insubstantial, really. So yeah, yes. So to answer your questions, do I think the culture wars are going to stop once Biden has a running mate who's a woman and does his thing? No, absolutely not. They will find ways. They will always find ways to make everything about the cultural. Look what's happened with the coronavirus. It's become completely politicized. Yeah. And the mask, the mask meme is like the new Je suis Charlie or the pussy hat.
Well, look, Meghan, I'm not going to keep any longer, Meghan. I really appreciate your time. The book is genuinely phenomenal. It's the best book I've read this year, and I'm looking forward to reading more from you. So thanks so much for your time.
Oh, thanks. I appreciate it. Stay well.